Hey guys, this is Bradley back again with Roll Radio. I'm here today with a very special guest, the co-founder and CEO of Commsor, Mac Reddin.
Hey, pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me.
Before we dive into Commsor, all things community, how you formed this amazing community operating system thesis, I really just want to know a little bit more about you. Tell us about your upbringing and where you came from.
Short version or the long version? I guess short version. I got bit by that entrepreneurial bug when I was like 14. I don't know. Time makes those numbers blurry. And I found there was an arbitrage opportunity in Lego sets when I was a freshman in high school. Basically, you could buy a Lego set and part it out for 2 to 3 times the cost of the Lego set because this like adult Lego group of builders would pay a premium for specific pieces and things like that. So I was doing that, and that really gave me that feeling of, oh, cool, I can do my own thing and make money. And very different. We make $10,000 at 14, you feel like a billionaire, right? That's really how money feels at that age. Starting a company accidentally my freshman year of college and dropped out. It was built on top of Minecraft, basically used Minecraft as a gaming engine and built a centralized network of players to come and play the content, and got to go to Minecon and TwitchCon and all these events and talk about it. And total accident. One of those, it was 4 years where not a day felt like work. It was just having fun. But that really got me down this path of thinking about community intentionally. And then there's the stories that people don't love to tell as founders, where you have one company that's successful, and then you have 4 years of trying 12 other companies that go nowhere. And then eventually you end up with one, in this case, Commsor, which so far seems to be working. But I like to say that I've founded 10 companies and they've been bookended by 2 successes so far.
Yeah, Commsor is definitely working so far.
So far, knock on wood.
So I know briefly this concept started off with you like managing a Slack group for community managers, but really tell us exactly how you got so involved specifically in community management and where that spirit came from.
I've used a line that I've been a community builder for 10 years, unintentionally for 5 years and intentionally for 5 years. All that Minecraft stuff was unintentional community building. I wasn't thinking of myself as a community builder. I didn't read community books. I didn't self-identify in this space. But after stepping away from that business, it was when I realized that community and the community building had been what I enjoyed the most. It had been what made that business successful. And that's when I started being intentional about it. Commsor actually started, it was originally called Commsponsor, which is, fun fact, where the name comes from. We dropped the SPON and it became Commsor. And it was actually started as a Product Hunt had a no-code maker festival in 2019. I just wanted to have an entry for that I wasn't thinking I was going to do. I think we got 50th out of 55 entries, didn't do very well. And it was originally a marketplace for indie communities. So a bunch of my friends were running communities in New York where they had their data science meetup or their New York City Ruby developers. And it was independent, not associated with companies. And they would struggle to get a company to give them meetup space or cover the cost of pizza for a meetup or provide a speaker. So the original idea, it was essentially an Airtable sheet. It was this no-code janky thing. And it was basically, community can list themselves. What kind of category are they? How many members are they? What kind of sponsorship are they looking for? And companies could use that to reach out to them and connect with them. So for companies, if you were a company trying to hire Ruby developers in New York, you'd love to provide meetup space for the Ruby developer meetup group because they'd come into your office and hang out. And it made, I think it was like $400 or $500 within its first week. And I quit my job basically the same day that it made that money. I don't know what this thing is, but let's go. Spent the rest of 2019 building these community monetization tools for indie communities, and then accidentally stumbled into the thesis that Commsor is built on now, which eventually led to the pivot in early 2020, and roughly here we are now. So it was an accident. The community we started for community builders started in the middle of that pivot as we were trying to figure out what we were doing in the community space. As I'm sure other startup founders know, you're like, I want to build something in fintech. You start building one thing and what it looks like a year later is completely different.
That's so interesting. That's how it started. We're all hearing a lot of buzz around the word community. You guys have really tapped into that in a successful way. We'll get into some of the branded things you guys have done so far, but I think one of the most brilliant things you guys have done is just putting this term forward of a community operating system. What does that really mean? How does like a company break down what that means and how to sell that idea?
It's definitely a little bit of a, I don't want to say buzzword, right? But you have to put a label on what you're building in a very short and concise way. And it is really this thing that community teams have historically, community managers and wear their teams, because very often community teams are still individuals and not full teams, but they've lacked tooling. The core thing we set out to solve originally when we pivoted was community managers were wrangling spreadsheets and Airtable. And the idea was, let's build, we called it a community CRM originally. And now we've built more and more things on top of it. The idea was community manager, if you're a marketing person or a salesperson and you say, I need tools to do my marketing job, it's not a question of do you have a tool to pick from? It's a question of which of 7,000 marketing tools are you going to pick for your marketing job? Community managers haven't had that. They haven't really had the tools. They've had that choice of community platforms. You're going to host it on Slack or Discord or Discourse or Telegram or whatnot, but they haven't had the back-end tools. And that's where that community operating system term came from, because it's more of it's the back-end play for community. We're not trying to build the platform where the community hangs out. We're trying to give community managers the tooling to do their job better.
Incredible. Let's talk a little bit about who are some of the companies using Commsor and who should be using Commsor for all the CEOs or community managers out there. Is it for a 1 to 2 person team? Is it for a target? How do we think about what you're building?
For the sake of not dying a death by 1,000 cuts, we're very focused on B2B companies right now. A lot of the kind of consumerization of enterprise, like the prosumer companies, where they have this bottoms-up adoption model. I think a good example of a prosumer company would be like Figma, right? Like they sell to individuals, but their real end goal is to sell to companies. So they have this kind of community-led bottoms-up model of individuals use the product who then bring it into their companies. That's been our core focus, at least for now, that we have had inbound interest from consumer brands and retailers and nonprofits and governments and gaming companies. But as early stage startups, you have to keep yourself somewhat narrowly focused. And for the most part, they have to have at least a dedicated community manager. If you don't have someone who's on the team who can use the tool, it's only going to go so far, because community is one of those things where you can't automate community. You can't build a data-driven community. So we actually just say that our tool it's not data driven, it's data augmented. You still need a person. Like what makes community is people and relationships and authenticity and this like human connection. You can't automate that with a tool. So you need to have someone who can build those boundaries and bring people together and give people a reason to gather. And sure, a tool like Commsor can help give you the data and the insights to understand how you're doing it and what the impact is and make better decisions, but it's not going to do that for you.
Awesome. Totally agree with that. And I know you guys are in beta. From understanding what Commsor is and just listening to you talk about it, it's almost like you guys are allowing community managers to plug into this matrix and see the whole system in this hub. And for the companies that you're working with, what's generally been the response from heads of community and community managers?
It's been great, obviously. What else would I say? But no, I think beyond just Commsor, I think just the explosion of community tools in the last year in general, a lot of community managers feel validated in their jobs, right? There's finally tooling for them, whether it's Commsor or not. Historically, they've struggled to be able to prove the value or prove that their job exists. It's extremely validating to have tools that are purpose-built for your role. Imagine being a marketing person and your email marketing tool is, well, you have Gmail. You can send emails with that. Like, and that's what community managers have dealt with for years and years. At the community manager level, there's a lot of excitement that people are finally building for them. At the CMO and the CEO level, where they've already invested in community, they get excited because they can start to actually prove their initiatives. We've spoken to a lot of CMOs or community, correctly or not, is rolling up to marketing, and they have all these marketing initiatives and they can prove the impact of all of them except for community. And so they get excited about being able to actually put numbers to it. It depends on who you talk to at different companies in different stages. The most exciting for me is always like when you talk to a community and you're like, oh my God, like this proves the value of what I do day in, day out.
Yeah, it's almost like community has been last place for a few companies, and you guys are putting that forward. And I know you and several other companies have put together this pledge that's been going around of what it effectively means to be, as you say, community-led company. Can you give us some insight on what that term means and really how we can get started if we hear you and just want to be a part of that movement?
Yeah, so it originally started as, you've heard of like sales-led versus product-led. And originally it was, what is a company that puts community at the core of what they do look like? And that's obviously where community-led plays into that whole branding. But I think it's really this thing where, and excuse my kind of crass way of putting it, community has historically been the bastard child at companies. Some companies have put it under support, some have put it under marketing, some under product, and most companies haven't quite been sure where it lives up to. But community can't exist for the sake of sales or for the sake of marketing or for the sake of support. Community has to exist for the sake of community. And that's really, truly what being community-led means is, are you really valuing community for everything that community can be? And yes, community can and will spin off benefits for the rest of the business. It will spin off benefits for sales. It will spin off benefits for marketing, but it can't exist purely for those benefits. Otherwise, it's a transactional community, and that's not what makes a community. This community-led movement is really about putting our stake in the ground for what does doing community look like? what does value a community manager, right? I know people who were running community at billion-dollar companies 10 years ago in San Francisco. They were like the heads of community getting paid $50,000 a year. Like those days are gone. It's not just about treating community, but it's also about valuing the people who put the work in to enable community to be done.
Amazing. And just in your own words, what does it mean to be a community manager? What makes a good community manager? Is it, or head of community? Is there a formula? Are there just things we should understand?
No matter how I answer that, community managers listening to this are going to be upset with me because it is such a broad and open-ended thing, right? If you ask 10 different companies and 10 different people to define community, you'll get 10 different answers. What community looks like at Salesforce versus Figma versus a gaming company versus a nonprofit, they're all very different. I was just having a conversation with someone recently about how there was a company that had job posts out for community managers, and one of the requirements was you need to be an extrovert. It's like, do you though? I was like, I'm a hardcore introvert. And a lot of community managers I know are hardcore introverts. So I don't know if there is this like one defined profile for what makes a community manager. A lot of them are hardcore generalists. I think that's probably a function of they haven't had support or the ability to specialize because they've all just been lumped together. There's community manager. That's the title. You go to marketing, there's 100 different titles you can have. We're starting to see that happen now. We're seeing community operations, community marketing, community management, heads of community, VPs of community. So I think we'll see that specialization. And over the next few years, we'll be able to define what those different roles in community look like better, because right now they all just get lumped into community manager.
Totally agree with that. Aside from, being CEO of your company, you're not just a serial community builder, but you're also a serial community product builder. Just watching you put together these community products that are just coming out online has been pretty fascinating. So I want to dive into some of them and just hear what you're doing in and around community. Almost anytime I see a post from you, there's almost this new community product. And so before we dive into those, I just want to talk quickly about this concept of a community club, which you formed and what that means and who's a part of it and who's using it.
So the community club, I think you might notice a lot of the things we do, they start as accidental ideas and morph over time. It was called Community Chat, and it was a Substack newsletter. And this is back when we were in this middle of pivoting about a year ago. And they're okay newsletters, but like an aggregation newsletter, right? We were just like collecting good blog posts and good tweets about community because we were doing our own research, and it was a way of collecting our own research into a weekly newsletter. I actually reminisced about this not that long ago because it was like the 1-year anniversary of that newsletter. I think the first went out to 8 people, 4 of which were my family. That's how these things always start. So it started as that, and then it picked up some steam and got a few hundred subscribers. Then we just launched a little Slack community with the idea of let's just give a place for the people who are subscribed to the newsletter to hang out. It wasn't intended to be a standalone community. That kind of happened organically over time. And now it's got a whole brand, its own voice, and it is actually very intentionally separate from Commsor. And it's this community for community builders. Whether you're an indie community builder building a community for your local chess club, whether you're the head of community at Salesforce or running community for a local government, whatever it is, it's a place for them to gather. There's a lot of reasons it exists, right? You pull people together, they'll do a lot of interesting things. But because so many community managers are teams of one, they don't have people on their internal teams they can turn to talk about the latest things in community, ask about new tools, talk about engagement strategies. So we've intentionally, in our mind, framed Community Club as the extension of your team. It's the place you go to talk about community building. And that's the underlying goal there. And it's very separate from Commsor. People have been in that community for a year who don't even realize that Commsor is associated with it. It's a very intentional choice because, once again, it's there for the sake of the community. It's not there for the sake of Commsor.
And so C-School, the most recent thing I heard about, is an extension of that. As a brilliant take on school, I've never heard of that concept. As soon as you put those, 2 words together, it makes sense. How did that come about?
I'm trying to remember how that came about exactly. Would you believe me if I said that we had the idea, we thought, so Noelle on our team, she's running that program. And also, by the way, all these things here should just blanket statement, credit to the whole team that we have behind me as well, building all these things, because it's definitely not just me anymore. So I can't take 100% of the credit, but our chief community officer, Alex, and I were talking about how we had companies reaching out again and again. They're always asking, how do they hire their first community manager? And you can't get a college degree in it. There's no official training. If you go ask most community managers today, you'll find that they fell into it accidentally, maybe as a hobbyist and then professionally, or they were in marketing and support and got sucked into community. So there hasn't been a hands-on program to actually train the next generation of community managers. And there's actually a shortage of trained community managers right now, where there's so many companies that care about it. But this is a little bit like this self-fulfilling prophecy, where if they take someone from marketing and say, figure out community right now, that person might not do community, which then might make it look like community is a failure to that company. And it becomes this whole self-fulfilling prophecy. So the idea was, we were sitting talking about this and we were like, we should launch a hands-on, originally it was like, Lambda school, but for community builders. Let's just get people together, train them. We'll help place them in jobs and help train this next generation of community managers. We had that idea in November. We both looked at each other on a call and said, Noelle's the perfect person to do this. We called her up and we're like, hey, do you want to come build it with us? She's like, sure. 2 weeks later, she started with us and now we're launching the program.
And tell us a little bit about that. What does it mean to go to C school? Who should apply? What do you get when you get out of it?
It's a 12-week hands-on, cohort based. It's small. It's 12 to 15 students at a time. It has career support at the end. The idea is we're looking for people who are not community managers right now, but would like to explore community as a career. So the idea is to take you from 0 to 1 to the point where you get your first role as a community manager at the end of the program. That's the very high level version of it, really. But it's a career training program versus you're interested in community, let's just watch some webinars and learn about it. There's a 10 to 15 hour a week commitment, and it's a real program.
And is it for someone who's just curious about community? Who's the target community builder there?
It's definitely someone who's curious about it, who doesn't have hands-on training, who probably doesn't have a full-time role in community yet. Someone who wants to be a community manager. So if you're working in marketing right now and you want to make the switch and become a community manager, this is the perfect program for you. We've got a few people that have applied for it already who are doing community at the hobbyist level, but would like to level it up and turn it into a career. So it's not for the community manager who's been there for 10 years, though you didn't hear it from me yet. And I'm sorry, rest of the team, for leaking this before we agreed to, but we are going to launch probably towards the end of this year, a second program, a community leadership program, which is designed to take someone who's a community manager, but wants to maybe become a head of community or a director of community and actually go from being a community manager to leading a community team.
Incredible. Tell us more about the Buildies and how this award show came around makers, not necessarily community builders. Is that correct?
Is it a cop-out if I say it started as a joke again? It was the Forbes 30 under 30 came out in beginning of December. And I saw a tweet about how we need a real award show that celebrates the makers, not just those who've raised a bunch of money, which is essentially what the 30 under 30 is. I basically sat down on a Saturday. I saw that the domain name thebuildies.com was available. If the domain's available, that's a sign. You have to do it. It's like the Dundies from The Office, but the Buildies, this is where the name came from. I saw the domain. I bought the domain. I DM'd a bunch of people. I built a Webflow site and launched it that week. So it started as a joke. It wasn't even like a team thing. Like the team showed up on Monday. I was like, hey guys, I built a thing. It's not a by Commsor. It's not necessarily associated by Commsor. It was really just a for fun thing. I think that's my approach to just things in general, is if you have fun with it, people can tell. I think that just comes back to community. Community can and should be fun. You look at the community club's website, it's fun. It's not stuffy and corporate feeling. If I may say so myself, I did design it, so maybe I'm not allowed to give my own feedback on it, but this idea of just like putting fun into what we do. The community is the best way for a company to put a fun personality out there.
Let's get into something where our goals and visions may intersect. We've both thought a little bit about what digital community can be in the next decade, definitely in very different ways in the beginning, but are probably directionally complementary. So at Roll, we really think of community almost in this way of sort of ownership through assets that are represented in the community. As a blockchain first or crypto company, this is largely through assets that are social in nature, that are branded towards the community. And we've built markets around these things. There's hundreds of people now on Roll with their own currencies. We're seeing brands, agencies, we just had a PR agency issue events, creators. How do you think brand or community having its own currency can change the relationship it has with sort of consumers or the internet in general?
I have a lot of thoughts there. I'm trying to condense them into a somewhat concise way. I think a lot of it is this idea of community ownership. Have you seen I can't remember who coined it, but the idea of exit to community? Actually, that was the last podcast you had, wasn't it? Yeah. But I think there's a lot of overlap there. Community starts by some people bring people together, right? But for community to really grow into this next stage, you have to have this idea, and I credit to the authors of the book Get Together, this idea of passing the torch, right? Community can't forever revolve around a single person. It's an audience if it revolves around a single or a small group of people. And community, when you scale it and you do it right, it's about enabling the community to build the community. It's like community by community for community. And I think social currency can be a really great way of just enabling the community to get involved in a more not a real way, but a more like official way, if that makes sense. We enable people to like host their own events or start their own subgroups with us or things like that. But it's very manual. It's very limited in who can participate. There's also a gamification aspect to it. I think also it actually can be a double-edged sword. It's a place where brands have to be careful with, because when you over gamify things, it can be opened up to abuse or finding loopholes to like maximize it, especially if you're putting currency involved in it. You have to find that right way to do it. But I think there's a lot of enabling the community to own the community itself, rather than the community just being like run by a small group of people. And we've actually toyed with that idea of, could we one day spin the community club out so that it's not owned by Commsor, but it just is? Outside of just currency, there's a whole like governance and other whole set of questions to figure out there. Could a community exist without a centralized authority willing it to exist, essentially?
That's a very, very long question, and there's many people trying to unpack that. So as this is emerging, I'm very curious of your thoughts about how this intersects with platforms like yours. Do you see a world where community-led platforms and brands are integrating these sort of social currencies or tokens into their systems to start engaging and rewarding users, almost like KPIs or metrics?
It's a very open-ended question. There's a lot of ways that it could work out. And I do think it comes down to, like I said, that double-edged sword of making sure it's done, especially right now with community being such a buzzword. There's a lot of companies just slapping community on things and saying it's a community. What I care a lot about over the next 3 to 5 years is not just making sure that companies care about community, but making sure that they care about doing community the right way, right? Making sure that they're doing community in a way that is open and a safe space for all community members to be a part of, making sure that there's trust and safety and moderation at the core of the community. Because all too often, especially in digital communities, community leaders, companies, whoever is running a community, they don't care about that until it's too late. You look at Clubhouse right now, love them or hate them, they have a huge trust and safety and moderation issue that they ignored until they had millions and millions of users. And now they're trying to scramble back on things. I know that's an article, I think it was in Bloomberg, where how like a bunch of like black doctors are like, this stuff that's being happening on Clubhouse is wrong. What is like, this is whole like disinformation loop about like, you can't trust black doctors. Like, what is that? Right. And because they just let it happen. So I think companies have to care about that from day one. There's a lot of interesting overlaps where if it's done, that currency part can be tied into that. I think like Twitter, they're doing their whole thing with like the bird watch, right? Which is like enabling the community to be a part of it. And one angle of it could be they're using the community to handle their moderation for them. But I do think at a certain scale, it all comes back to the idea that community has to exist for community. And I think social currency can be a really good way of incentivizing community to exist for community. And that didn't quite answer your question of how can it integrate with platforms, but if there's currency involved in communities, the platforms those communities live on will have a reason to be involved in those currencies.
Absolutely. Before we get into Commsor and just what's next for you, I'm just so curious, what does that concept of social currencies look like in 2025 to you?
I do not have enough brain space dedicated to having thought about that to have an honest answer for you. That is my honest answer. I missed the boat on crypto 7 times. So I'm the wrong person to give a really robust answer to that. I do think it'll be really interesting to see where it gets used by community versus audience. I think right now there's a lot of really obvious use cases for audience. Like I know you have Terry Crews doing a currency. And like that to me is like, that's audience, not community, which is still great. It's also freaking cool that you have Terry Crews using your platform now. So like small fanboy moment here, but it'll be really interesting to see, I think, what it looks like with community and what it looks like when it's done right with a healthy community. I think that's, so not a prediction, but more what I want to see happen and what I'm curious to see what that looks like.
Absolutely. Yeah, let's dive into what's next for you and Commsor. I'm so curious about the next few years of Commsor. I think you're, truly just Nathan with sort of exit to community, the vanguard and like of what, it means to have a digital community, especially tied to a brand. Would love to hear about your funding round and just what's on your roadmap for the next few years.
So we just raised an A round, and it's like we kind of have 2 streams of work. We have the community club and we have Commsor. Our team right now is actually about 40% work on the community club and C-School and community initiatives full time, which I think is very unusual for early stage startups, not to have 100% of it behind product and sales. A lot of our focus in the next year is focusing on community at the executive level. I think there's so many resources and books and podcasts and people you can follow on Twitter who talk about community and community management and day-to-day stuff. It can be a little bit of an echo chamber because it's like you say community should be valued and a bunch of community managers are like, yes, it should be. I'm like, yeah, it should be. But we have to do a lot more work convincing CEOs and CMOs and executives to care about community, because if community managers are just shouting about it, that'll only go so far. It has to come from the top down, unfortunately, to some extent. So we're doing a lot of work around resources and content for not just what does community management look like at a day-to-day level, but what does community management look like at an organizational and an operational level.
Totally. And just really curious for the aspiring community managers out there, for everyone listening, what steps can you take to start like building that career? You've been doing it as a hobby, or you're helping out some friends at a startup. What's next? How do these types of folks move forward?
Besides C School, I think join a community like Community Club or CMX. There's a couple of them out there. They have different vibes and slightly different directions. To find the one that's right for the kind of community you're trying to build and the kind of career you're trying to build. And there's so many books and so many resources. One of my daily struggles working in community is that almost everyone else who works in community is an awesome person that I would love to talk to for 6 hours at a time. And I could spend all day just talking to community managers because they're genuinely good people. Join a community, find community managers, talk to them. We're all very willing to talk about community. I think especially right now, because for so long, no one has been willing to listen to us talk about community. So if you want to reach out to a community manager who's doing it right now, find someone who's doing community in the space you want, whether it's gaming or developer relations or, B2B SaaS, find someone who's in that space, see what they're writing, reach out to them, talk to them. I guarantee you 9 out of 10 community managers you DM on Twitter, they'll respond, because that's just what we do, is talk to people.
And how and where can we find out more about yourself and Commsor?
Oh, I guess Commsor is commsor.com. Community Club is community.club, not communityclub.com. Just to be weird and different and hip. And then the offer of DMing a community manager, if you want to talk about community, extends to me as well. I'm the T-Guns. I'm the least professional Twitter handle ever. There's a whole backstory to that one. But in general, my virtual office door, is, if I were to put it really cheesily, is always open. I'm always happy to shoot the shit about community with anyone, whether they're a community manager or an aspiring community manager. Community is what I live, eat, dream, think about 24/7. Eat, maybe not the right term there, but it's everything I do. So I'm always happy to talk about it with anyone who wants to hear more.
Amazing. Mac, thanks so much for stopping by Roll Radio.
Awesome. Thank you for having me.